Hello, I'm Corinna Harrod and this is the Monday Night Review. Hello and welcome to episode 84 and the first one of 2023. I hope you all had a lovely winterval break, Christmas break, if you celebrate Christmas, just some time off if you don't. I think it's the only time of year. I know there are lots of places that don't celebrate Christmas, but for us it's pretty much the only time where there's genuinely nothing doing for about a week to 2 weeks, and it is so nice. I'm always slightly ready for the kids to go back to school, for the post to be delivered. I don't want to be a typical British person, but the post troubles we've been having, right up there with the weather at the moment. We had a lovely break. The kids went back to school this morning. I can hear the dripping of a gutter not properly fixed at the back of my office, so it's back to admin with a bang. But not before I record you this late in the day. It's Wednesday, it's not Monday. Episode. It could be a two-parter. I'm going to try and make it one because I think it would work better as one, but it might be a long one. So we're just going to see how long it takes and go from there. But when you hear the content of this, you'll understand why it was slightly difficult for me to do with a 10-year-old, 7-year-old and 5-year-old constantly wanting me to play Talisman. I have to say, if you have kids who are into like elves and witches and that kind of thing, or dare I say it, boys, I'm sorry to not be more gender varied, then the game Talisman is absolutely fantastic. I'm saying this as I would have found it deeply boring as a girl. I think my sister might have liked it, but my 3 boys, it's one of the few things that all 3 boys will play anytime, anywhere, anyhow. So that's my top tip. My top present tip. So useless on the 4th of January. So yeah, it was difficult to write about these horrible things that we're going to talk about today with the children there. And today we're going to talk about something that quite a few of you may have inadvertently heard of and not realised. If you're British, and maybe even if you're not, you may have heard the expression sweet FA and assumed that it's the shortening for sweet fuck all. And you would be right, sort of. It actually has an incredibly sinister background based on the gruesome murder of an 8-year-old girl in the market town in Hampshire, and its rather gross adoption into Navy slang. Today we're going to cover the Alton murder, also known as the murder of Fanny Adams. I can't believe it's taken me 84 episodes to cover this story, as I lived in Alton until I was 2, and then I went to school there until I was a teenager. It's where my local railway station is. I know the town fairly well, but this story does take place in 1867, so a little bit before my time. And back then it was a small market town known for tanning and brewing were the 2 main industries of the town, and that's where we're going to be today. It is a fairly grisly story, so if you are someone who finds the true crime aspect of this podcast difficult, I will give you warnings before I cover anything, but here we go. Fanny Adams lived with her father George and mother Harriet in a small 2-bedroom house on Tanhouse Lane in the north of Alton. She was one of 6 children and lived next door to her paternal grandparents and a couple of doors down from her best friend, 7-year-old Minnie Warner. So they were part of this community. They were family rooted in the town. The children loved to play in the flood meadow at the end of their road, and on the 24th of August 1867, after lunch, Fanny, Minnie and Lizzie, Fanny's 5-year-old sister, went off down the road and through the newly installed gate to the meadow at the end of the lane. It was a really hot day, and for crowded homes with big families in, like those who lived on Tanhouse Lane, it was usual for the children to go out playing, get out from under their mother's feet. The mothers had housework to do and often had small babies at home. So you can imagine in a small house having your older kids running around was too much. So it was totally normal for the kids to go off and play during the day. Now, Alton's principal economy was in brewing, and beyond the flood meadows lay the hop gardens. And at this time, they were a week away from being harvested. So there were 9-foot hop poles covered in leaves from the vines and basically resembling a small man-made wood that fringed the north of the town. This not only accounted for a lot of work for the people of the town, but it meant that there was more than the average amount of pubs in Alton. There's still a lot of pubs in Alton. George Adams didn't work in brewing or for the local tannery. He was a bricklayer, and his family were hard-working, church-going and law-abiding. They were not rich, they were respectable. The girls knew how to behave, and that afternoon they wanted to go to the meadows. And in the meadows there was the River Wey, and it ran through the meadows and it formed a shallow area that was almost like a swimming pool where boys could swim, girls could paddle, obviously, and the girls liked to pick wildflowers there. So it was sort of safe, shallow, beachy area where the kids could play. And this is where Fanny, Lizzie and Minnie are heading for. And they are picking wildflowers, and it's here that they are approached by a man. And he offers them 3 halfpennies, which are called halfpennies, for Minnie and Fanny to race to the Hollow. So the Hollow is an old byway that runs across the top of the meadow, separating it from the hop gardens. And this is not a small amount of money at the time. So the girls agreed, ran the race, and when they returned, he offered them more halfpennies to run to the hop fields, and he said once they got there, he would pick berries for them. This is a no-brainer for the girls. They're together. The owner of the hop garden knows that families walk there. He doesn't mind as long as the hops aren't damaged, and a lot of the families would work for the brewers anyway. And it's nice to have grown up paying attention to them. He's offered to pick them berries. There is no stranger danger in 1867 in Alton. Nothing bad really happens there. So the girls race up, they arrive at the hop garden, they eat some berries that the man has picked for them. And then the man offers Lizzie and Minnie more money if they want to go to the sweet shop and buy sweets. And he says he wants Fanny to go with him to the village of Shaldon, which is nearby. Fanny says no, she wants to go home, and he offers her 2pence to go with him. That's a lot more. She still says no. She says she wants to go home to her mother. And with that, the man tells Lizzie and Minnie to go. He picks Fanny up and walks away. And Minnie takes Lizzie and they return home, which seems problematic perhaps to some, but she has no reason to think anything bad's going to happen. A few minutes later, Eliza White, who's walking home from her shift in a hayfield, hears a child scream. It's hard to know what time Lizzie and Minnie get home. 7-year-old girls are not that reliable on the time. At the best of times, this is an era before watches and clocks and that kind of thing being dotted around everywhere. So they get home at around 2:30. The mothers are both busy, and later their guilt for not being more attentive when their daughters come home and say what happened means that they become more vague about the timeline. So both Minnie and Lizzie mentioned to their families that there was a man who they met who gave them money for sweets. But as I said, it's an era before stranger danger. Paedophilia isn't even a thing. The age of consent is 12, and men who find younger girls attractive, although it's not sort of a pat on the back thing, it's sort of overlooked and doesn't have the stigma it does today. So it's not really news. It's only at about 4:30 that afternoon when Harriet Adams starts to wonder where her daughter Fanny is. She goes to the neighbours to see if they've seen her, and whilst talking to Jane Gardner, they see Minnie returning from the sweet shop. She's very pleased. She's got very little of her money left. She's had a really good time at the sweet shop. And Jane Gardner and Harriet Adams ask Minnie exactly what happened. Minnie Warner tells them what happened and was able to describe the man that she'd seen that afternoon. He wore white trousers, a light waistcoat, a tall, dark hat with a pale complexion and smooth hands. Not a man who worked with his hands, not a man who worked the soil. He's a gentleman. This is also an indicator as to why Minnie and Lizzie were not concerned at all for Fanny. The fact that a gentleman was paying attention to them, and gentlemen are above suspicion in many ways. So she gives the two women this description, and Harriet Adams and Jane Gardner set off for the Flood Meadows. And as they reach the gate, Emma Smith, who's also a neighbour living on Townhouse Lane, she lives near the new gate to the Flood Meadows, and she said that a man matching that description had just been seen walking on the footpath by the river. So Jane Gardner and Harriet Adams rush along there. They catch up with him, and Minnie, who's with them, is able to identify this man. And the women ask outright where Fanny was, and he said he left her playing by the gate that led to the hop garden from the hollow. Mrs. Gardner said, "I have a mind to turn you over to the police," to which the man replied, "I'm quite willing to go with you to the police." They asked him his name, which he refused to give, but he said that he worked at Mrs. Clement and Son, the solicitors in the High Street. And this did the trick of making the women less suspicious of him immediately. As I said, no gentleman with such a job as to work in a solicitor's office would have anything to do with the disappearance of a child. Jane Gardner even apologised to the man, and he says no worries, and he walks off towards town. Harriet Adams runs to the hollow shouting for her daughter, and when she can't find her, she returns home hoping that Fanny has gone to the Butts, which is a big area of green in the village, in the town, to watch her father playing cricket, but she was nowhere to be found. This next bit is not nice, so if you need to fast forward a little bit, it's quite descriptive. So at around 7:30, a search party set out towards the meadows and the hop gardens. So in August at this time it would still be light, but by the time they reach the hop field, and the fact that there are these 9-foot poles with white bines going up the sides of them, it's almost too dark for them to really see very much. They have lanterns, but then one of the searchers, Thomas Gates, a labourer who worked for the brewers, gives a horrified yell. Lying on top of 2 hop poles was the head of a young girl. Muddy, eyes missing, gashed from lip to ear. It was the head of 8-year-old Fanny Adams. Gates picks up the head and continues through the hops, where he then finds the severed right leg, and then further on he finds a human torso. The torso has been gutted, and the intestines and other internal organs are gone. He goes on to find a bloodied dress. Meanwhile, another man, Harry Allen, shouts that he's found a heart, and over the next few hours they find her lungs, an arm, intestines, and left foot, which horribly is found by a shoemaker, and they also discover her brown velvet cap that she was wearing. Her eyes are found staring up out of the river on that beach area, luckily by a policeman, I believe, not a child, and all the pieces are then carried by engine driver Charles White under the direction of local policeman and first police presence on the scene, Thomas Light, and they are carried to the Leathern Bottle pub nearby, which may seem odd, but at the time taking human remains to the pub, it was fairly normal. That's where inquests were often heard, in the upstairs area. The pubs upstairs would often have a big room that could be used for meetings and things like that. And in lieu of having somewhere better and more suitable to take someone for an autopsy or anything like that, quite often it would happen in these rooms above the pubs. So William Cheney, head of the Alton police force, asked Harriet Adams to identify the dress that they'd found, and she and Jane Gardner were able to give a description of the man they'd spoken to and his place of work. Being a small town, the man was quickly identified as being Frederick Baker, a 29-year-old legal clerk from Guildford. Cheney arrives at the offices of Clement & Son at 10 minutes past 8, followed by a large group of people. And when he arrives, Cheney finds Baker smoking a cigar, seemingly waiting for the police to arrive. Cheney searches him and finds 2 small stationery knives on him, which to me initially seemed odd. But at the time, anyone like a clerk who would be writing in ink would use a very sharp pocket knife to erase the ink, basically gently scratching it off the paper, and it would need to be really sharp. And it would turn out that Baker had sharpened his knives the day before. So Baker is held there for a while and then formally arrested on the suspicion of the murder of Fanny Adams. And to avoid the crowd of now around 300 people waiting outside, they go out the back to the police station further down the high street. When they arrive at the police station, Baker is strip searched and his clothing examined by police surgeon Dr. Louis Leslie, who found what looked like blood on the cuffs and on the bottom of the trousers. Remember, he's wearing white trousers. So Leslie also had the gruesome job of examining the body of the deceased child and stitching it together as best he could for the child's father to formally identify her. This bit is grim, so you may want to fast forward a bit. We're just going to talk about his findings as he examined the body. So when he arrives at the leathern bottle, which was next to the police station where Fanny's body was taken, he found a child's trunk from which the head, both legs, and one arm had been removed. The remaining arm had been almost amputated below the elbow. It was barely attached. One of the legs, though found, was missing a foot. The intestines were entirely removed, meaning that both the chest and pelvis had been scraped clean. The right ear had been removed, and a large gash went from the ear to below the lower jaw. Her eyes had been removed, her spine dislocated, and internal organs scored through after they had been removed. So I believe they found most of the internal organs, though at that time of night, in a wooded area, there is every possibility that there was animal activity beforehand. There are 2 things that they don't find, which we'll talk about in a minute. So throughout his initial arrest and imprisonment, Baker remains calm and collected. He maintains his innocence. On the 26th of August, so 2 days later, he's taken to Chawton House. So Chawton is a very small little village near to Alton. And he's taken there to stand before the chief magistrate. And the chief magistrate hears the story and remands the prisoner on the charge of willful murder. And he then sets the date for the magistrate's hearing to be held on the 29th of August. Interestingly, the chief magistrate was Edward Knight, who is Jane Austen's nephew, and Jane Austen lived in Chawton. So you will often see signs to Hampshire saying that it's Jane Austen country. So it may get confusing for anyone who doesn't know. I mean, not that I'm a law expert, but if you were arrested, you would be taken before the chief magistrate, who would then decide whether you were going to be held or not held. And if you were going to be held, you then went in front of the magistrates, which would be a number of magistrates from the town or the area who would hold an inquest. And if you were found guilty at this inquest, you would then be sent to the assizes. So before every town had a court and before there were separate trials for things, they would have quarterly assizes in the big towns. And so the big town near here is Winchester. So the Winchester assizes would happen, and every case that had gone through the magistrates' courts in the local areas and had been found guilty would then go to the assizes, which were presided over by the London judges, who were considered the best. That was what your court hearing was. So quite often you would be held in prison for a long time before your court appearance anyway, because you'd have to wait for the next local assizes. So meanwhile, the search for the child's missing body parts had become a ghastly fascination, with people coming to the town to see the murder spot and perhaps find something themselves. They were coming down on the train. One man, William Walker, who was a local man, found a bloodied flint, which he placed in his window for passers-by to see before the police got wind of this and confiscated it. And Dr. Leslie would eventually identify the flint as the possible murder weapon. There was blood, there was hair on it. The grisly hunt was still on by the time the inquest started on the 29th, and a mob formed outside big enough that the police guarding Baker and taking him into the inquest had been hit by missiles, and the prisoner was nearly lynched. By the time he reached court, Baker, who had been fairly calm up until this point, was visibly agitated, as you would imagine. So Frederick Baker looked younger than his 29 years. He's 5'3", so his height doesn't help, and his preference for wearing a top hat, probably to make him appear taller, apparently just made it look more like he was playing dress up in his father's clothes. He was described by those who knew him as very old-fashioned and methodical in his habits. Since his arrest, he had studiously avoided allusion to the grave charge against him. For Harriet and George Adams, the horror of losing their child, compounded with the vicious way she was killed, meant that their grieving had to be done in the public eye. And for some accounts, they played up to this. When families were bigger and medical science less advanced, infant mortality was something that people at the time had to deal with. But having such a horrendous murder, and the first in Alton history, really, probably not the first, but the first public one, meant that some believed that they played to the crowd a bit. George had to identify the remains of his daughter after they'd been assembled and sewn together by Dr. Leslie, and Harriet had identified her clothing. And then George was the first witness to be called at the inquest on the 29th of August. And Minnie Warner was also called. She'd failed to identify Baker at the first inquest on the 26th, but this time she readily identified him, and it appeared that she had been prompted. The inquest also heard from witnesses who had seen Baker in the meadows on the afternoon of the murder. Some of these witnesses could have been caught up in the whole drama of the case, but one, Eliza White, seemed very reliable. Not only did she recognise all three girls, who often played with her daughter Ellen, but she saw them with the man and noted in her first interview that they were picking berries, which fits with the original story from Lizzie and Minnie, which she wouldn't have heard at the time when she was first interviewed. So she is a very reliable witness, and when asked if she could identify the man they had been seen with, she turned to Baker and said, "That is the man, sir." Amarant identified Baker as the man who had held a gate open for her at the churchyard at 2:45 this afternoon. She remembered him because she thought he was very polite, but then he kept turning round to stare at her, and she'd noted that as being strange. Minnie's 15-year-old sister said she had seen Baker at 5 o'clock that afternoon at the top of the hollow where it joined the hop garden. Mary Ann Porter, who lived at the toll house on the Basingstoke Road, saw a man matching that description given by the children, white trousers, tall hat, bending down and doing something with his trousers or shoes. And he turned and stared at her in such a way that she really noticed it. Now, Porter is a good witness because she's used to looking out for people in case they needed to pay the toll. So at the time that she saw Baker, she was sitting inside her doorway watching the road, basically. Now, the court was next to hear from Dr. Leslie, who described what he'd found when he examined the body in the grisly detail that we've been through above, so I'm not going to go through it again, but summarising that, in fact, the body had been hacked to pieces. He believed that Fanny would have been insensible by the time dismemberment began, having been knocked unconscious or killed by several forceful blows to the skull, possibly using that flint stone that William Walker had found. He also, in a polite way, told the court that there was no way of knowing if the child had been raped, though Fanny's breastbone and vagina were never recovered. At the time, it was thought that this in itself was a sign of politeness. You know, he hid them or buried them because they were such private things. Though assessing this now, we'd probably find that the opposite, that this had much more sinister connotations. I would love this case to be covered by Paul Holes and Kate Winkler-Dawson in Buried Bones, to hear the forensic thoughts behind this, because it is such an intense murder in such interesting times, where if Fanny's attacker had raped her and not murdered her, it would have been obviously a lot worse for Fanny than for him, in terms of she was well developed for her age by all accounts, whether she was tall or whatever. And at the time, it would have been said, shockingly, it's still said by many today, that she had encouraged it, or she had acted in a way to entice her attacker. Rape was not a capital offence, and her age wouldn't have had any bearing on it. So Dr. Leslie had examined the prisoner on the night of the murder as well, and he'd found that Baker's socks and trousers were soaked with water, and traces of blood on the shirt cuffs and possibly the bottom of the trousers too. When asked about this, Baker replied, when he had asked Baker about the appearance of blood, Baker had replied, "I don't see any cuts or scratches that would account for it." Dr. Leslie examined the blood under a microscope, but could only confirm it belonged to a mammal, and was unable to confirm if it was human or not, which is typical for the time. How amazing would it be if this blood had been kept so it could be examined now? So it's at this inquest on the 29th that we hear for the first time about Baker's drinking, when Police Constable George Watkins is next to the stand on court. Now, George Watkins was in charge of Baker at his office before he was formally arrested, and while there, Baker told him that he had been drinking gin and beer since 10 o'clock that morning. He also said that Baker asked who the child was who had been killed, and then said he often gave halfpennies to the children, so he didn't see how people could think it was him, which is a bit of a leap. Baker said he was in the habit of walking in the early morning dew, which is what had made his trousers wet through. Watkins stated that he hadn't asked this. So there's, at the time, a lot of people believed that the police would ask leading questions to get people to talk themselves into trouble. And so throughout this case and the inquest and the trial, the police have to reiterate whether they had asked any questions. They were not supposed to speak to prisoners once they had been arrested. And so Watkins said he didn't ask him any of these things. This is what Baker shared on his own volition. But surely on a hot August day, if you've been walking in the morning through the dew enough that your socks and your trousers are soaking, by 8 o'clock that night, it's been hot, maybe your socks would still be wet because they're not out in the air, but the bottom of your trousers wouldn't be soaked. Soaked is the word that's used. I would have thought that wetness would have had to have happened far more recently. So junior clerk, 15-year-old Morris Biddle, was the next witness, having sat opposite Baker since he arrived at the firm 12 months earlier. He said that on the 24th, all four clerks had been in and out of the office, though Baker had disappeared for longer amounts of time. And at 6 p.m, he had returned to the office saying some woman had grabbed him in the flood meadow and accused him of taking a child, which we know happened. That was Harriet Adams and Jane Gardner. Now, this would be surprising if he were innocent, and it would also account for how he was waiting for the police when the police arrived. But it's really upset him. He's really flustered, and he says to Biddle, "It would be very awkward for me if the child was murdered," which I think is an odd thing to say. So Biddle sees that Baker is upset, and he takes Baker to the Swan pub over the road, even though he said he was aware that Baker was already drunk. So they go over to the Swan, which is opposite the office. They have a drink, and the two men start talking about running away. Baker says, I'm going to get on a train on Monday and disappear. And he says to Biddle, "You should come with me." And the bootman at the pub overhears this and says he hates his job and he thinks about running away. And Baker says, "Well, you should come with me." And the bootman has a bit of a joke and says, "Well, I can do any job, but you're basically a desk jockey, so what job are you going to do?" And Baker replies, "I could turn butcher," which I think is quite niche. I think that's, but maybe not. I think personally, to me, I mean, this has obviously been raised as suspicious, and to me, I think it is. But maybe at the time, it was a job that you could do because no one else wanted to do it, that didn't need formal training. But make of that what you will. So Inspector Samuel Everett had been put in charge of searching Baker's lodgings and office. Now, nothing is found where he stays, but the drawer of his desk at Clement and Son, when searched, reveals a diary. And it turns out that Baker was an assiduous diary keeper, and on the Saturday of Fanny Adams' murder, he had written, "August 24th, killed a girl. It was fine and hot." After this is read out at the inquest, there's not a lot more to be said. Baker declined to call any witnesses and only said, "I am innocent as the day I was born." Mr. Edward Knight, as presiding magistrate, committed Frederick William Baker to stand trial for the murder of Fanny Adams at the next Winchester Assizes. So, as I said earlier, Assizes are courts held in the main county towns of the area and were presided over by visiting judges from the higher court based in London. They take place every quarter, and the judges and jury needed to not only be decided about guilty and not guilty, that was basically down to the inquest, but they needed to see that it could be proved beyond reasonable doubt that something had taken place. Sir John Mellor was the judge for the trial of Frederick Baker, which would take place in December. The trial started on Thursday, the 5th of December at Winchester Castle's Great Hall, and there were so many members of the press present that day that they ended up having to squeeze onto the jury bench, which must have been confusing. Baker pleaded not guilty, and the jury were reminded by Sir John Mellor that they had to base their decision on the evidence that they were about to see and hear, and that evidence only, not all what they might have heard or read on the case in the previous couple of months. This is a big ask. The murder of Fanny Adams was the only murder of note in Alton's history, and it was the talk of the town and the surrounding areas, and constantly in the press, especially as it was so gruesome. If you think of the time before TV, this was fascinating to lots of people. And I'm not entirely sure who or how they chose the members of the jury at the time, but they would I would have thought, have been men from the area, meaning they, from the moment it happened, will have been hearing and seeing things. The prosecution stated that though there were no witnesses to the murder, there was damning circumstantial evidence, including witnesses seeing Baker carrying the child towards where her dismembered body would later be found, blood on his clothes, and the entry in his diary. Interestingly, although I think the defence messes up in the end, they would also say there is cutting up a dead body is not a crime. So you see how the intricacies here are at work, where the jury has to decide beyond reasonable doubt that he killed Fanny Adams, not that he dismembered her. It could be that he found her body and decided to dismember it, is basically one idea of the argument, even though it seems very unlikely. So that's what we are looking at. They have to show to the jury that he killed her and not just dismembered her. Now, Minnie Warner is there, 7-year-old Minnie. She's now in the possession of an expensive doll to get her over the fear of appearing in court. The prosecution have given her this expensive doll, and not only has she perfected her identification of Frederick Baker, but she has added to her story. She said that Baker had approached her in the meadows on the 17th of August, a week before the murder, when she had been playing with some other girls. He had walked with them and then told Lizzie Adams, who was there as well, and Minnie to go home. But this time, Minnie that all the girls had stayed together. He hadn't picked anyone up. And she was confident that Frederick Baker was the man that she had seen on the 17th and on the 24th of August carrying Fanny away while she cried for her mother. Again, had this been a rape case, then this double identification would just have, rather than us seeing it as predatory, he's talking to young girls constantly and giving them money and sweets. This would have been seen as he's a perfectly innocent man, but who played with children fine. But Fanny had obviously enticed him. It's just such a different way of thinking and viewing about things. Minnie does not fare so well under the cross-examination of the defence. She, at one point, says that she heard the church clock strike 4 when she returned home to her mother. Now, all witnesses had spoken of seeing Baker with the children an hour and a half earlier. So with Minnie saying that it was in fact 4, this would throw all the timings off, as you can imagine. She then added to the confusion by saying she'd gone to buy sweets and returned home at 5 o'clock, and she knew this because she returned home after her mother had eaten. However, her teenage sister would later be more decisive on times, saying that Minnie had come home at 2:30, triumphant with the money, and then went out to buy sweets. Eliza White, though agreed by both sides to be an intelligent witness, also became confused under cross-examination. She repeated her previous statement about seeing Baker playing with the girls. She recognised the girls, they were picking berries. But when she was questioned, she admitted that if Baker had been with the girls on the 17th, could it have been that day when she saw him? And she did say, yeah, she could have got confused. However, Minnie, this doesn't come up, but for me, Minnie identified Ellen White, Eliza's daughter, as one of the girls that she had been playing with on the 17th. So surely that would make it easier for Eliza to differentiate between the 2 days. Was her daughter present? If yes, then it was the 17th. If no, then it was the 24th. I believe from Minnie Warner's story that on the 17th, Fanny Adams was not present. Eliza White was, Lizzie Adams was, and another 4th child was present. On the 24th, it was Lizzie, Minnie, and Fanny who were there. The defence continued to do what they had realised was the best course of action, and that's to confuse the hell out of everyone and make the witnesses doubt themselves. A lot of the witnesses were working people. They, as I said, not everyone was wearing watches, and there's not digital clocks everywhere. So timings are set by the work rhythms, that kind of thing. So you are dealing with a lot of people who have not been in this public situation before, who are not used to this way of being. So it's quite easy to confuse people and to make the witnesses doubt themselves. Now, the prosecution then called 7-year-old Alfred Vince, who had not appeared in front of the magistrates, and his testimony would ruffle some feathers. Now, Alfred had been standing at the gate, the new gate at the end of Tannhouse Lane that led to the meadows, at 5:30 on the afternoon that Fanny Adams was murdered. And he says that from there he saw Baker walk across the hollow to the bathing place, that little beachy area of the river, where he washed his hands. And Alfred says that his hands were red and then pale when they came out. The man then saw Alfred looking at him, shook his fist, and charged towards him, and Alfred ran away. Now, obviously, this is deeply incriminating, but again, the defence do a good job of making this witness look unsure. It turns out that Alfred had been unable to identify Baker when taken to Winchester Jail, even though Baker was in a lineup but was made to stand 2 foot apart from the other people in the lineup. Then when Alfred is taken to the jail a second time to identify Baker, he identifies him only when nudged by his mother, who was an alcoholic and who had been boasting in the pubs in Alton that her son had been a witness to a murder. So whether he was or not, he could just have been used by his mother to back up her drunk bragging. And this is also confirmed by the lady at the toll house, who had been sitting by her door that afternoon and looking out towards the gate and the flood meadows, and never saw the hand washing, and she never saw Alfred Vince. Morris Biddle was, for me, one of the most interesting witnesses. It's interesting just from the point of view of wanting to understand about Victorian working practices and Victorian life, but he also knew Baker and knew of Baker's behaviour, obviously, before he knew anything about the murder. He said the clerks arrived on Saturday at 10 a.m. This was normal. They would then decide who would take their 2-hour lunch breaks and when. And then they would spend the day going in and out of the office, going to the shops, running personal errands. And it was understood that if one clerk was always on duty, then they were basically free to manage their own time, like human beings. It sounds slightly more forward-thinking than a lot of workplaces today. Just going to throw that out there. Interestingly, Biddle is 15. It's the same age as Minnie Warner's sister. But he is not doubted in the same way that the children are doubted. He is respected in interviews. He is a working man. He's able to go to the pub. He is trusted and treated as such. It's so bizarre that I just find, especially at this time when, in England, in Britain, the age of consent is 16. You can't drink until you're 18. You can't drive until you're 17. There's such a discrepancy because now it's so different to this era where there's the age of consent is 12. If you're a working man, you are considered a man. It's just a completely different way of being. And the first question that was asked of Biddle was whether Baker appeared drunk when he arrived for work at 10. Now, Biddle says yes, and that Baker had told him that he'd been drinking in the Windmill Inn that morning. He said he went out twice that morning, presumably for a drink. One time was for 15 minutes, the other time was for half an hour, and was the sole clerk on duty when Biddle went home for lunch at 1. So remember, they took 2-hour lunches. When Biddle returns at 3, Baker was out, getting back to the office 25 minutes later, so about 3:30, let's say. He went out again at 4:30 and came back at 5:45. Biddle himself went out from 5 until 6, and that's when he came back, and they go to the Swan together at 7, where they have the drink and the conversation about the missing girl, and Baker says he could be a butcher. They leave the Swan at 8 p.m. and Baker goes to do some grocery shopping. Biddle returns to the office to be told of the discovery of Fanny's body and that the police want to speak to Baker. So he's sent out to find Baker, greeting him with, "Baker, they say you murdered a child." And Baker says, "It's a bad job for me then." They return to the office and wait, and soon the police turn up to speak to Baker. Biddle is also useful because he identifies Baker's handwriting in his diary and confirms that it could not have been written in the late afternoon or early morning without Biddle seeing him do it, and Biddle did not see him do it. Biddle's a reliable witness, despite being 15. He was friends with Baker. He was basically Baker's assistant, from what I can tell. He had no desire to incriminate him. They got on well. They sat opposite each other every day. There's nothing in their personal lives that would make Biddle want to throw Baker under the bus. So this testimony is really damning. He also confirmed that when they were in the Swan, Baker mentioned that if the girl was found murdered, it would be bad for him, though Biddle himself obviously didn't know about the actual murder until afterwards. So it's a big jump to go from "there's a girl missing" to, "oh, if they think I murdered her." One thing that is troubling about this case, one of the many things that's troubling about this case, though, and was brought up by the defence when cross-examining the police, involved in Baker's arrest, was that Baker was not drenched in blood, as one would imagine the murderer in this grim case would be. The two doctors who were witnesses at the trial had differing ideas on this too. One of the most interesting people at the trial was Professor Alfred Swain Taylor of Guy's Hospital, who was one of the leading forensic scientists in Britain at the time. And though he specialised in toxicology, he had been taking Baker's clothing and the flint on the 31st of August to see what he could find. Now, he determined that most of the stains on the clothing turned out to be mud, but there are a few spots of coagulated blood on the front of the clothing, including the cuffs, thighs, and bottoms of the trousers. The blood on the cuffs was so diluted with water that it was barely detectable. No blood is found in the pockets or on the buttons, and he finds no evidence of intercourse, so no semen is found. He also confirmed that the flint was stained with blood from a person, though the knives found in Baker's possession only had a slight blood smear on one of them, not consistent with weapons used to carve up a body, and he said that if they'd been cleaned, they would show signs of rust. Though surely if they were cleaned and then dried, that wouldn't be the case. And I would assume that you would clean them, you would use your pocket handkerchief to dry them rather than leaving them to go rusty. He did point out that if the body was left for an hour or so and then cut up, the blood was more likely to seep rather than spurt, so the lack of splatter on Baker's clothing didn't necessarily mean he was guilty. Didn't necessarily mean he wasn't guilty. He thought the blood on the clothes could be more likely to be from a nosebleed, though we know from Baker he didn't make any reference to having a nosebleed. Now, when we speak to his family later on, they would say that Baker did suffer with nosebleeds as a child, but Baker didn't make any reference to this at all whenever he was questioned. So Taylor says that to cut up a body in the way seen in this case would take someone with a standard sized knife about half an hour. He then goes off on one about homicidal mania, explaining to the court that someone can just be overcome with a burst of madness and kill a totally random, blameless victim and then is indifferent to the punishment. He goes on about this a lot, almost like he's paving the way for Baker to plead insanity, which was not the plan. Dr. Leslie is next up and had described how it had taken 2.5 hours for him to reassemble the 2 sackfuls of body parts from the murder. It was now that he went into explicit details. At the time, obviously, everyone was very prim and proper, but he went into the details stating that the vagina or private parts were missing and have not been found. He stated that Fanny had died from a sharp blow to the head, probably from the flint found by William Walker, and her body had been dismembered at least 30 minutes later. Though he agreed with Taylor that the small knives found on Baker were not suitable for the task, they would account for the jagged edges he had found on the body and on the organs, stating that it looked more like she was torn rather than cut apart. He gave the timings as 10 minutes to remove the head and about another 50 minutes for the rest. Leslie contradicted Taylor by saying that with careful placement, it would be entirely possible for Baker to position himself in a certain way to not get covered in blood. The defense pointed out that the witnesses hadn't been that reliable. They'd wavered on time, on the identification of Baker, and they determined that in terms of the diary entry, it could just be a drunk man writing "a child killed" instead of "killed a child." Earlier in the year, he'd written "a child drowned in King's Pond," and if this was reversed, it would read "drowned a child in King's Pond," which obviously is very sinister. I don't know how much I go for this. Also, a comma would change the sentence to "killed a child," though I find that much less believable. I also don't think he was drunk enough to get his words round the wrong way. He obviously is drunk, but I don't know. I don't buy it. I think the diary entry for me is very, very suspicious. So Samuel Carter's closing argument is very convincing. Surely the jury could not believe beyond reasonable doubt that Baker was responsible for the murder. Had he stuck to this argument, the outcome might have been very different. He was right. The witnesses were unreliable. They had changed their minds. They weren't firm on identification. The fact that Baker was respectable would have definitely influenced the jury. He had no, as far as they were aware, no nefarious history. But Carter goes on to say that if Baker had killed Fanny Adams, well, then he did that while he was insane and therefore irresponsible. Surely only a madman could have committed such a terrible crime, and as Dr. Taylor had said, homicidal mania is a thing. At the very least, this showed that his own legal team were not confident in Baker's innocence. It was such a bizarre turn. Carter went so far as to go into detail about how Baker's family was filled with violent, dangerous insanists. So his client, who he'd just shown maybe couldn't have done it, may have done it because he came from a long line of maniacs. The witness statement from Baker's father wouldn't have done anything to dispel this idea. Frederick Baker Sr. comes to the stand. He's a master tailor from Guildford and told of how his son had been a weak child under constant care of the doctors with nausea, frequent nosebleeds, and was so ill that it meant he didn't go to school until he was 12. And then at 16, he had a life-threatening attack of typhus, after which he always complained of his head. He wasn't strong even after he started work as a clerk, often complaining that the work was boring, bursting into tears at dinner time. He sounds like he's quite emotionally unstable. Mr. Baker Sr. himself had experienced a severe mental breakdown, including paranoid delusions, in which he chased his daughter with a poker, trying to kill her, and accusing Frederick and his sister of poisoning their father. Frederick Jr. had been hoping to marry a girl that he'd been courting, and she broke up with him. The story believed by Frederick was that the girl's brother had told her about Frederick Sr.'s mental episode, and she had been wary of this and broken off the engagement. And Frederick Jr. took this really badly. He believed that his father's mental illness had been discussed and himself slandered. That's a quote. He went around saying it. In Christmas 1864, he walked into a road hoping that he would be run down, and Mr. Baker described that at the time he believed his son was out of his mind. So then they spoke to a couple of witnesses from Frederick Baker's time in Guildford before he moved to Alton. And one of them was John Davis, a bricklayer who was an ex-police sergeant, who said that Baker would often accompany him on his beat, talking wildly, pulling weird faces and laughing like a loon. Baker was also known to go walking through the countryside late at night, and he had once seen him Davies had once seen him brandishing a pistol and a dagger. He'd at one point had Baker arrested for his own safety, having found him standing on a bridge looking as though he were about to jump. And when questioned, Baker said he was going to, quote, do something that would be talked about. And after that, his father made him sure he basically had a minder to keep an eye on him. But Frederick Jr.'s bizarre behaviour continued, with him convinced that his father's prayers were the only thing keeping him from killing himself. He would thank his father every morning for his prayers that had prevented him from killing himself. He then started going out all night drinking. Now, he would go out all night and his father didn't know what he was doing, and it turns out he was drinking. When he was 26, this is what he started doing. His father believed him to be a teetotaler, But Frederick Baker was becoming a frequent flyer in the local bars and displaying bizarre drunk show-off behaviour, eating half-cooked sausages, knocking the tops off beer bottles and drinking them through the jagged edges, downing 10 glasses of beer in a row. Mental illness aside, we all have that friend who gets into teenage bad behaviour later in life and then is a real pain about it. It sounds like Frederick Baker was doing that. People found, I think he got encouraged by people in the pub, but his behaviour was also unacceptable. He's annoying everyone, he's behaving badly and worrying his family to death. And then he just disappears. He vanishes for 16 months and it's not quite clear why or where he goes, though some press alluded to it being something to do with interfering with a young girl. Again, you can't tell whether that's the press making it up, if there's never any evidence shown for this. Some believe that he spent a night or two in the Lambeth workhouse and was begging in London. But he appears, he comes back, he goes home, and it's decided then that he should have a fresh start in Alton. And it seems to be working. And Alton, now by car, is about half an hour from Guildford. So it's a bit away from home, but it's in the area. So he would be visitable by his family. So this new start seemed to be working. He gave up drink, he started going back to church, he helped with Sunday school, and he did lots of extracurricular things, and it seemed like he was back on the straight and narrow. His letters to friends told of how happy he was, he enjoyed his work. But in the spring of 1867, he was back in the pubs and his appearance deteriorated. And one of the things that he seemed to do was this sort of competitive eating, which is really weird. He would like obsessively eat stuff. So then on the witness stand is one of the family doctors who was questioned about the Baker family medical history. And he told of a cousin who had spent at least 4 stints in medical asylums, including 2 in Bethlehem Hospital, also known as Bedlam. During this time, he had displayed distinct homicidal tendencies, but in between times had been perfectly capable of holding that down a job and functioning in society. At the time of Frederick Baker's trial, this cousin was in an asylum and unlikely to make a recovery. Another family doctor described the Baker family as basically being constantly on the edge of psychosis. During this time, mental illness was seen as hereditary as eye colour and hair colour. So the doctor's testimonies showed a man who was not only capable of mental breaks, but one for whom alcohol had a disastrous effect. So this is going to have a huge effect on the jury. If you believe that mental illness is winging its way down the family, then it's not. Then Frederick Baker is going to have those problems. The diary entry was made before anyone knew that Fanny was missing, let alone dead. So even if it was written wrong, so killed a girl or a girl killed, he couldn't have known that Fanny was dead unless he discovered the body and not told anyone. However, the judge reminded the jury that they had to believe beyond reasonable doubt that Baker had committed the crime. The jury retired at 7:05 and returned just 20 minutes later with a unanimous verdict: guilty. Baker was asked if he had anything to say. He didn't respond. The judge donned his black cap and told Baker that he would be taken back to Winchester Jail and in a fortnight's time hanged by the neck until he was dead. The judge urged him to use his remaining time to reflect on this terrible crime, and it was noted that the judge seemed more upset about it than Baker did. Interestingly, over the next 2 weeks, people campaigned for Baker's sentence to be dropped to life imprisonment. None of them thought he was innocent of the terrible murder, but they did think he was mad and therefore exempt from the gallows. It was implied that Baker was the victim of bad genetics, and his behaviour in the previous years had shown him to be, quote, an imbecile. Baker himself made no reference to the crime during this 2 weeks and read his Bible, spoke to the chaplain. Some stories circulated that Baker had disappeared for 16 months, having either kidnapped or attempted to kidnap a young girl, and there were rumours that he'd been seen scouting for little girls in the weeks leading up to Fanny's murder. Now, as I said earlier, the rape of an 8-year-old girl at the time, though a crime of rape, was not a capital one, and as Fanny was often described as tall and developed for her age, the age of consent at the time was 12. Paedophilia did not exist in 1867. Then it would have been a completely different crime. Had Baker raped Fanny, it would have been more damaging for her than for him. Obviously, I know that it is more damaging for the victim every time mentally, but it would have been her fault. Again, we're talking about Victorian times here, not modern ones. Not a lot of progress has been made. So while he awaited death, Baker read the Bible, prayed and talked to the prison chaplain. He wrote to friends saying that he'd asked God for forgiveness for what he'd done. He also now writes a confession. I don't know why. There's something about this that I don't know. In his confession, he says he left Clement and Son at 1:30 on the afternoon of the 24th of August and walked to the flood meadows where he met the 3 girls. They ran races for 20 minutes for halfpennies, and then Minnie and Lizzie had said they wanted to go home. Fanny had run into the hop garden. He followed her, scooped her into his arms, and then attacked her. He said it took him 2 minutes to remove her head. He had sharpened his penknife the day before, and then he removed her eyes, pocketing them before holding the gate open for the lady who had witnessed him, remarking he was amazed she did not notice his bloody hands, and then he washed his hands and deposited the eyes in the river. He went back to work and returned to her body at 5:10 and dismembered her, saying it took just 10 minutes. I'd be interested to know, this is why I want Paul Holes, be interested to know how easy it would be to dismember a body left out in the heat for 3 hours. Easier. Definitely less bloody because the blood will have settled somewhat. But I don't know about rigor mortis and that kind of thing. Interestingly, throughout his confession letter, he refers to Fanny as it, not her. And for some, this points to Baker being bad, not mad. Frederick Baker was the last person to be publicly executed at Winchester Jail, being led to the gallows on the 24th of December 1867 and dying in front of an audience of over 6,000 people, some of whom had walked overnight from Alton to see justice served to the murderer of an 8-year-old girl. The hangman was William Calcraft, one of the most prolific and perhaps inept of his kind. He relied on the old-fashioned short drop method, where prisoners were slowly strangled to death, rather than a longer drop, which would break the neck. The slower dispatch would give more time for Calcraft, who was renowned for his bad taste, to add some extra drama to the event, pulling on the condemned man's legs, or in some cases even sitting on their shoulders in an attempt to break the victim's neck. As he was given the rope and the prisoner's clothes and personal effects, and indeed access to the body after the execution, he could sell whatever he liked and would get a better price for it the more drama that was involved. Sometimes in place of an assistant, he didn't often work with an assistant, which was frowned upon, but in place of an assistant, he would have someone there who'd paid him to be allowed to be in close attendance. He really is. I'm fascinated with anyone who can be an executioner, because I think it's such a fine line between serial killer and approved executioner that it's very George Orwell to me. But he really is one of the worst in terms of enjoying and encouraging human suffering and having no morals whatsoever, whilst being treated like a bit of a king by anyone in power. Now, it should be mentioned that there was another death that some believe is linked to Frederick Baker. In June 1866, so this, I believe, is around the time that Baker had disappeared for 16 months. Jane Sachs is attacked near Guildford. She's stabbed in the throat, partially severing her windpipe, and her tongue is cut out. A horrendous attack, and one that left her dying, but able to identify her murderer as 21-year-old James Longhurst, who would be hanged for the crime. The death of Fanny Adams called some to question whether the wrong man had been sent to the gallows. Longhurst had maintained his innocence to the end, and his execution was really awful. And he was basically had to be restrained up until the last minute because he was fighting so hard. Could the identification of a dying 7-year-old unable to speak and suffering greatly be taken as 100% certain? Newspaper reports at the time, though, state that Longhurst was found near the scene with a bloody knife on him. And if that is the case, then I think they probably did get the right man. But I don't know enough about the psychiatry of it, but it seems very strange that a man who has thought of physically harming himself and attempted to physically harm himself would suddenly go from 0 to 100 and just do something so intense and horrible without having done anything like that before. So for me, that I wonder if he had done something before that he hadn't been caught for. He is obviously a writer of diaries, so I'm guessing that he would have written down if he'd done something similar. But Jane Sachs seems to be linked, the story of the death of Jane Sachs seems to be linked to the death of Fanny Adams, wherever you read about it. Now, for many people, Frederick Baker is a name lost in history, whereas you'd be surprised how many people know the name Fanny Adams or unknowingly use reference to it, often with the expression sweet FA. Now, this is because in 1869, the British Navy introduced tinned mutton to its rations with the fairly new technology of canning. Now, canning was often a way of using inferior meat and offal, and sometimes the tins weren't airtight, so the meat would begin to turn within days. And a joke arose amongst the sailors who were in charge of feeding the other sailors in Deptford about how the putrid mutton they were being made to serve was in fact the missing bits of butchered Fanny Adams, and thus Fanny Adams became Navy slang for this disgusting mutton or meat stew. The cans they came in are still called fannies, and then basically translated to being anything worthless. Sweet Fanny Adams, sweet FA, which then morphed into sweet fuck all. And that is the horrendous story of the Alton murder. My sources for this was I heavily used the Fanny Adams chapter in Victorians Undone by Catherine Hughes, National Newspaper Archives, the Four Marks Murders by Chris Heal, and there's some of it on the internet, but it is really difficult because even as I was reading through the newspaper articles, some bits were definitely drama inducing rather than factually accurate. But yes, it's a horrifying story. And even now, if you talk about the history of Alton or you mention Alton to some people, they will say, Fanny Adams. So it is a very grisly start to the new year, but a good story. And for many people, they believe that Baker shouldn't have been killed. He was a man not in possession of his senses. As always, I'd love to hear from you. Send me an email, themondaynightrevue@gmail.com. You can find me on social media, where I'm at The Monday Night Review on TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook. You can buy me a coffee and you can join the Patreon, which is the same as Buy Me Coffee, but different tiers. You can have ad-free episodes, you can have some mini-sodes, or you can have the full shebang and have ad-free episodes, all the mini-sodes, all the stories. And until next week, be kind, stay safe, and always check the back seat before you drive.